he fighting with me. He hit my head with the knife.
And he never helped me out with my green card. 13 years of marriage. You know, like he kept postponing it and then throwing it, oh, if you get it, you're going to run away. If you get it, you're going to leave. So that's another form of abuse, which I didn't realize till a lot later.
The Family Justice Centers are the one-stop shop where city officials say all help is available for all victims and survivors of domestic violence, whether they are documented or not.
We don't actually ask questions about someone's status until the point at which it becomes relevant in the conversation. So usually that's when we're asking someone whether or not they'd like to meet with an immigration attorney.
But there are huge obstacles for those who are undocumented.
For an undocumented person, there are hurdles everywhere. Like I think from the day one that they start, everywhere you go, especially with benefits, with the legal system, with the police system, with the job system. I mean, nobody wants to offer a job to a person who doesn't have papers, right? I mean, so the challenges are numerous. It's huge, and it's strange how somebody must have stayed in this country for decades and still doesn't have access to resources like somebody else would have. I mean, their kids could all be citizens, but then they are not documented, and they'll either have to wait for their children to grow up and then sponsor them.
They no help in nothing because I have a problem. I no have a social security number. I don't have a work permit. I can go any place and take the job.
In the shelter, they help the ones that have papers. If you're a citizen and you have papers, then they help you out get a job. They'll help you with any. I don't have papers to go work legally anywhere. And in the shelter, instead of them understanding that, okay, she's undocumented, she has a son, whatever, no, they keep, when are you leaving? When are you leaving? Did you get an apartment? So every time I sit down with the caseworker, I have to tell her, do you remember I'm undocumented? It's the same caseworker. Do you remember I'm undocumented? Did you find work yet? No, I didn't find work yet.
Apana says her undocumented status also deprives her of benefits that single parents like herself get.
Being a single parent, being in the shelter, there are funds available to help me, but because I'm undocumented, it's not available there for me.
Women in Need is the largest provider of shelter and supportive housing to homeless families, especially women and children in New York City. It also shelters victims and survivors of domestic violence.
We never ask about citizenship. So undocumented women, their children, undocumented husbands or boyfriends are all completely welcome at a WIN shelter.
Whether or not they ask about status, there are services that are simply not for undocumented people. For example, permanent housing.
It is harder for undocumented people because the vouchers include federal money. And that federal money is obviously not usable for people who are undocumented.
We try to make sure that our case managers are the resident experts in knowing what types of benefits someone is entitled to, regardless of their immigration status. But there are some benefits that are tied to federal dollars, and those in particular oftentimes have restrictions related to what someone's status is.
I happen to have talked to women who are survivors, and they say they go to the family justice centers and they don't help them. So they say all the help that they say the family justice centers make available to victims, they don't get them. So they don't get any help, either with immigration or with housing. Even some women who don't really have an undocumented status issue, they don't help them. So what can be done to make sure that they pay attention to these women, the family justice centers?
I mean, that's a criticism of family justice centers for all women who come forward. And I share that concern. And that's why we have oversight hearings to see what the family justice centers are doing and try to bring attention to the fact that they don't necessarily, not only do they, there might be questions about how well they serve the people who come through the door, but also there's a vast number of people who don't even know they exist. so don't know to even go there to try to get services. We've definitely heard concerns, and it's why I've passed legislation requiring the office to end gender-based violence on what work is exactly done at FJC to try to get an understanding of whether or not people are served.
We do hear about the VAWA, we hear about the U visa. A woman I spoke to said she's been in the shelter for so long, and they tell her that, okay, with time you will have the VAWA. But in the meantime, I just want to understand what happens with them in the women's shelters or in shelters, in regular shelters. What happens to them before they get these visas?
So the city is often, more often than not, constrained by federal government rules. The federal government is the one that provides most of the housing vouchers. So when women come into a domestic violence shelter, an emergency shelter, they are not asked what their immigration status is. If they need help and they meet the criteria of needing that emergency help, they get a placement. Right?
Yeah.
The problem becomes after 6 months, because the first 6 months when they're in the domestic violence shelter, that's under city control. But after 6 months, when they no longer have access to the DV shelter and they can't get housing because the federal regulations don't allow the city to give vouchers for those individuals, then they get placed into the regular shelters and can languish there for a long time. What the city can do, and it's through their partnership with Safe Horizons, is help those women in any way that they can within the federal law. So let's say, for example, their children can have access to benefits. Then through their children, they might be able to be signed up for SNAP, food assistance, for Medicaid, medical assistance, or maybe even housing. But the city's hands are tied by the federal government's very strict rules against helping people who are not citizens. It's draconian. It's nothing I support, but that's the reason our hands are tied.
We had wanted to create a voucher that was just city money that undocumented people could use. But then when Donald Trump became president, we all put our heads together, and there was really a feeling in the community that advocates exclusively for undocumented immigrants that if we did that, there would be a list that the Trump administration would have of who the undocumented people were that got vouchers, and that was simply too dangerous. So it is harder for undocumented people to find housing options for themselves.
So with this, what you just said about creating something just for New York City, do you still have that in the works?
No, I mean,
Even for
we've
the future,
look,
without Donald Trump?
I think it's a very viable option when he's not president.
Okay.
When he's not president, I think it's a really viable option, but as long as he's president, we can't do it.
The survivors say Saki for South Asian Women is helping them with legal representation and some one-time payments for their needs, but can't help them with housing or a job because they need documents.
Last month, now together 3 months rent. I don't have a job. Now give you this, the Sakit give you this, the 1 month. But we need a more 2 months. I don't have a money, I don't have a job. Because I don't have a social security number, no have a work permit. That's why Saki no helping like this.
My lawyer said she would do it pro bono for me. my case. But then in the middle, she just kept dragging it, and then in the middle, like she decided not to do it pro bono. That I would still have to pay her 8,000-10,000. I just didn't have the money like that, so I withdrew my case from her. I called Saki, and they helped me get a free lawyer.
It could be even more challenging for undocumented victims and survivors of domestic violence to seek services when they have language barriers. Alice Hawks says the Family Justice Centers do all they can to provide language services to all who need them.
We try to have a case manager available who speaks the language of most of the individuals who come in. They would meet with a case manager, either speaking in that person's language of choice or using a telephone interpreter. We also have American Sign Language interpreters and certified deaf interpreters that are available if someone prefers to use those methods of communication.
But Chatterjee says the Family Justice Centers need to do more.
I will say why I would refer a client to Family Justice Center is because if the client is not able to come to me, say the client lives somewhere in Queens and she is not comfortable traveling 2 hours, then I would refer her to Queens Family Justice Center. That is the only reason why I would refer a client to Family Justice Center. And the moment Family Justice Center would discover that the client is not proficient in English, they refer them back to us. So sometimes it's very, very frustrating.
I share that concern, and that's why we have oversight hearings to see what the Family Justice Centers are doing and try to bring attention to the fact that they don't necessarily, not only do they, there might be questions about how well they serve the people who come through the door.
Mina says she is relying on hope.
My case immigration lawyer, she's applied for me 2017. She say you wait 3 years. She applied for me, this is the U visa.
As for Apana, she says she cannot leave the shelter.
Housing, they're only paying for my son, and he just turned 18, so benefits are less. And then I'm not getting any help with any kind of housing because I'm not a citizen. And I don't have work to work and be able to pay rent. So I'm stuck in the shelter.
The Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act VAWA, a vital piece of legislation that helps undocumented victims and survivors of domestic violence, is now stalled in the U.S. Senate.